Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome to Five of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series of videos will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films of this chosen year. Today's video we are talking about the year 2012, so let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, here are a few honourable mentions for this year. Life of Pi, Lincoln, Project X, The Avengers, Chronicle, The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, Flight, Silver Linings Playbook, and Argo. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. 21 Jump Street is directed by Phil Lord and Chris Miller and stars Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum. So if you've been following Five of the Best as a series from the start, you'll know that around the 2007-2008 mark, I mentioned this kind of defining era of comedies for me. A year that kind of or a time that started around, say, the release of Superbad around that time, and kind of led all the way through to now, of these comedies that I always remember fondly, and there was at least one or two each year from around, say, 2007 to, say, 2011, 2012, even maybe 2013. And they all kind of hit the same marks. They always had a core centre of characters that bounced well off each other, whether that be Superbad, whether that be Hot Fuzz, whether that be The Hangover. There was all these comedies, or even The Other Guys, where you have a core, whether it's 2 or whether it's 3 or whether it's 4 characters that just interlock and complement each other so well. And I think 21 Jump Street really is one of the best encapsulations of that in Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum, who prior to this movie you wouldn't have thought would have been such a gem of a comedic duo. Because prior to this, I have to say, Channing Tatum, yes, he's in things like Coach Carter and kind of similar more serious roles. I know he was in the Step Up movies, which were not great in my opinion. But for Channing Tatum, I don't think I ever thought he would be a brilliant comedic actor. But oh my god, was I so wrong. And he's been in so many comedy films after this, from 21 Jump Street, but I think this was the first one that really took notice of him. Whereas for Jonah Hill, on the other hand, Jonah Hill is a veteran of comedy films at this part, and not long after this, you'll have his break into stardom with things like Wolf of Wall Street and other things like that, other big movies and big, more dramatic roles for him. But 21 Jump Street took everything that he built in Superbad, of his kind of eccentric comedy and that kind of uniqueness that Jonah Hill brings to a comedic film, and he is just gold. There's no way about it. Jonah Hill in a comedy is just gold. I don't think there's ever been one where, maybe there's been comedies been in that haven't exactly hit all the marks, but I think in any comedic performance Jonah Hill's in, he kills it, and that's absolutely the case in 21 Jump Street. And for 21 Jump Street, for something that, to be based on a kind of dormant TV show, obviously, that birthed us Johnny Depp all those years ago, it really wasn't an IP that everybody went, oh my god, I can't believe they're finally doing that. It was quite unique in the sense of a TV show that nobody really, yes, I'm sure people remembered, but weren't in any way craving a return of 21 Jump Street or Jump Street as a whole. But to have this and to go into it, and I just think as a comedy and as a kind of buddy cop comedy, because obviously, yes, we've had cop comedies and brilliant cop comedies on Five of the Best previously, especially in Hot Fuzz or even in The Other Guys, where they're more, I want to say the word adult, but I don't know if that's right, because 21 Jump Street, yes, it does have adult themes, but it obviously is more of a high school comedy. Yes, they're undercover police and they're in the high school dynamic, and you've got people like Dave Franco in this. It's also one of my favourite roles of his in the limited time that I've seen him. Brie Larson also was introduced in this film, and she went on to a lot more things after this, of course. But for Jump Street, and 21 Jump Street as a whole, it hit every mark that I didn't think it could. And that sounds probably strange, but going into this, you would think undercover cops go into school and they have to, it's about a drug and it's all that there. But I didn't think that 21 Jump Street could be as good as it was. Once I heard the premise, once I seen the trailer, yes, it seemed funny. Yes, it seemed, okay, I'll get a bit of a generic laugh. But 21 Jump Street is one of those, like, I would say nearly iconic comedies of the early 2010s. Like, just of this era, say even in the last 20 years, if you go through the comedies that people remember so fondly, and so universally fondly, there's not a whole lot of people that have seen 21 Jump Street, or even 22 Jump Street for that matter, and I'm sure that'll make some kind of appearance, whether it be an honourable mention, or in the actual top 5 for that year. These Jump Street films really... I think everybody has a certain fondness to them, and it's hard to say that for a comedy because, of course, and I always say this for comedy films and same with horror films, of the subjective nature. I may find something funny, you might not find something funny. Some people will absolutely love 21 Jump Street, it's their favourite comedy of all time. Some people may watch it and go, nah, not for me. But I don't think there was anybody, I think there was very minimal people that came out of this and hated it, and that's a real testament to 21 Jump Street as a whole. And to have those two characters, Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum, bounce off each other so well and have the kind of... It's a greatly made story in the sense of two complete opposites of people, and then they go into the school dynamic and how the generations change. Channing Tatum, when he was at school, his character was at school, he was of course the jock, the cool guy, and he goes in essentially hoping to be exactly the same, whereas the situation that unfolds is that generations change, and now Jonah Hill's character is essentially the cool guy. And that dynamic and how it bounces off, and they're kind of fish out of water in some scenarios of, Jonah Hill is on the track team and Channing Tatum is in like the science class, and it's just, it does everything that it should, and it does it all so well. 21 Jump Street is one of those comedies that is just, it's defined so finely in a way that it allows itself to be hilarious. Do you know what I mean? That sounds really vague, but the scenarios it's in, because if you get the script and you get the storytelling and you get the, okay, I'm going to put these guys undercover in a school and that's it. But the way it's crafted, the way it's directed, and the way it's acted throughout the film allows hilarity. Is that the word? Hilarity? I don't think there is a word like that. I don't know if that's right. Anyway, but you get my point. 21 Jump Street is just hilarious to me. Yes, it's subjective. You might see it and go, not really for me. That's fair enough. But for me personally, 21 Jump Street gets complete recommendation for me as a comedy. Number 4. Skyfall is directed by Sam Mendes and stars Daniel Craig, Javier Bardem, and Dame Judi Dench. Now, this might be the first of the video that you're like, how is that not higher? How is that not number 1 or number 2 of this year? And I'm with you, I get it. Skyfall is undoubtedly a great Bond film. And if you've been following the channel for a while, you'll know I'm not the most versed in Bond content. My knowledge of Bond basically is Daniel Craig's tenure, from Casino Royale to No Time to Die. There isn't too much of the old generations, the Sean Connerys, even the Timothy Dalton, the Pierce Brosnan, any of that. It's not something that I'm too well versed in. But what I have seen and what I do adore is Daniel Craig's run as a whole. And I have said this before, so apologies if I'm repeating myself just in the sense of his Bond run, but he kind of had a win, a loss, a win, a loss, a win. So that was Casino Royale was undoubtedly a win. You've seen, if you follow the 5 of the best, you know it's appeared before. Casino Royale is awesome. I love that film, and it's to date my favourite Bond film. Getting that out of the way. Then we had Quantum of Solace, which I think is a stinker. I think that film takes everything that was good in Casino Royale and just goes, no, we're going to do something completely different, and it's not going to be anywhere near as good. Quantum of Solace, yeah, waste of my time. But then we have Skyfall here, and Skyfall is undoubtedly a win. And we'll get to it in a minute. And then after that, we had Spectre, which again, take everything that was good in Skyfall and just reduce the quality. Just wasn't as good. It had a few shining moments, a little bit, in different parts of Spectre, but not in any way did it encapture what Skyfall had prior to it. And then, of course, lastly, we had No Time to Die, which I really, really enjoyed. I know people were a bit mixed on it, but I think for me personally, I loved No Time to Die. So I love 3 out of the 5 of Daniel Craig's run as Bond. And you, like a lot of people, would probably say, but surely Skyfall's the best. Skyfall is undoubtedly the best of his tenure. Admittedly, I don't agree, and that's quite controversial, and I get it. And don't get me wrong, me not putting Skyfall above Casino Royale in my personal Daniel Craig Bond ranking doesn't mean that I think Skyfall is so far inferior. Not the case whatsoever. I just think Casino Royale hits everything that I want a kind of action spy thriller to be, and Skyfall... Okay, so here's the thing that kind of makes or breaks Skyfall, and that's the emotional side of it. I think, for me personally, I always find that, yes, No Time to Die now also had a lot of the emotional tropes, whereas Casino Royale is quite a cut and dry tale, if you get what I mean. Yes, it has the emotion with Vesper and things like that, and Eva Green's character, and yes, it has that dynamic, and there's the emotion, but it isn't bogged down by emotion, if you get what I mean. Whereas No Time to Die kind of delves a bit more into emotion of his connection with Lee Saido's character, and yes, it does have that a little bit, but I feel that Skyfall, it's shining light and its best part, but its focus on it takes for me personally takes away its quality compared to something like Casino Royale, where focus a lot more on the action and the set pieces, whereas the actual character connection to each other. And the connection in Skyfall is, of course, Dame Judi Dench. Dame Judi Dench is one of those actresses that is hard to use any other word than iconic. She is one of those actors that has been around for so much and so many different quality roles over the years. Certainly ones that I haven't even seen, but I know that people adore from maybe the 80s or the 90s or whatever the case may be. Dame Judi Dench has done it all. But I think, for me personally, I found her as M in Skyfall the shining moment or the shining light of this film. Because yes, Daniel Craig and the way he conveys the emotion, because of course he has to show the stoicism of a Bond. He has to show the undefeated nature of, the man that is James Bond, that can't be bogged down by love or any of that, or emotional attachment. He can't get it too attached to people simply as that. And of course he's employed by M and the whole of the Central Intelligence there, but it's clear the role that M and Judi Dench has to him. But this is the first time of course my knowledge doesn't extend, I don't know if that, maybe there were some of the earlier iterations of Bond that did explore this, but I think the way in which they explore Bond's relationship with M in this as like a mother, or in some cases a father figure, depending on the actor, this kind of bond that there you go, there's the pun, this bond that they have together, they really are, it explores so much of that emotion. And yes, there's some brilliant set pieces in this, some brilliant action set pieces, a brilliant bit on the train, like there's a lot of that. So don't get me wrong, let me say this in a way that makes it sound like I think there's no action, there's no gunfighting, there's nothing of what we love about Bond. I just think that, especially in the latter half of the film, the focus and the narrative changes so much to that I think it's brilliant in what they do in that. But I think I love it more as a film than as a Bond film. Do you get what I mean? I think I love Skyfall. If this was just like a thriller, and a spy thriller that didn't have the word Bond attached, I think I might love it more. Do you get what I mean? It's a strange one, but it doesn't let anything I've said there take away the quality that I believe Skyfall has. Skyfall is brilliant. Javier Bardem in this film, by the way. Oh my god. Him as Silva, isn't it? He's one of the more, I would say, maybe underrated villains. And I know I've heard some people say that the villain is maybe the weak part of Skyfall. I don't think so. Is he as good as Mads Mikkelsen in Casino Royale? He's not. He isn't. But he is really good. He's really good. I think, there's some real iconic scenes with them two throughout the film, of him and Bond, and maybe they're not as iconic as the torture scene in Casino Royale, but they certainly, it's memorable ones that are kind of burned into my head of this era of Bond, these 5 films. So many of those memorable moments are from Skyfall, and that's a testament to the film as a whole. Skyfall is so good, and I know it sounds like I've not loved it. I love those 3 Bond films, and I don't like 2. Of 5, that's a good, and I said this before, it's a good batting average for Daniel Craig as Bond. A really good 3 real top tier films, that spy films, not just Bond films, because of course we've had other spy films that have their own quality too, but it's just, Skyfall is so good. Yes, there's the emotional side that maybe isn't for everyone. Maybe that's why a lot of people loved it more than Casino Royale or No Time to Die. And I get that. But for me personally, regardless of anything else, Skyfall is top tier. Number 3. The Dark Knight Rises is directed by Christopher Nolan and stars Christian Bale, Tom Hardy, and Anne Hathaway. So The Dark Knight Rises is one of those films that is a bit controversial. A little bit controversial just because, and I think that we do have this kind of mindset that's, I don't know where it's developed from, but it seems to be, if a sequel to a film, or a follow-up to a film, isn't as good as the previous, and of course, it goes without saying, but I don't think it would have been possible anyway. The Dark Knight Rises could never have lived up to what The Dark Knight was. The Dark Knight is one of the greatest films in recent memory. Never mind comic book, never mind anything. It just is a brilliant film in everything it does. And then of course, with the passing of Heath Ledger, there was so much pressure on Nolan to finish this trilogy in such a strong way. But I think he did it absolutely. Is Dark Knight Rises as good as Dark Knight? No, it's not. But it in its own right is a brilliant film. You've got all, and it was iconic for the time. I've said that word a lot today, but it really was, especially, how many kids did you see that were dressed as Bane for that year's Halloween? Or, continue to do the voice. And he's such an iconic villain. Is he as iconic as Heath Ledger's Joker? Of course he's not. Of course not. But does that mean, just because something isn't as good as what came before, does that mean it has no quality whatsoever? That's so not true. And we've talked in length about sequels that are nowhere near as good as the original. But this isn't one of them. Because The Dark Knight Rises stands alone as its own great film, I think personally. But when you combine it with The Dark Knight and you combine it with Batman Begins, like, did everybody, if you look at it on the flip side, whereas The Dark Knight was so good, did everybody go, oh my god, Batman Begins is so bad by comparison? Nobody said that. Nobody did. But because Dark Knight Rises came after it, and it was like trying to live up to the expectation of the quality of what The Dark Knight had, it isn't as good. It's as simple as that. But that doesn't mean it's not great. And it is great. It really is. A lot more of the, this. I think in this film, Gotham is more of a character. And I know I've said that in different scenarios, but Gotham and the police force and the collapsing nature of nearly Gotham collapsing in itself due to the nature of what Bane does in this film. You also have Anne Hathaway as Selena Kyle, Catwoman, and that's also another dynamic that is really interesting, the way they bring her in. She's the one, and her character's role in the film is essentially to get Christian Bale and Bruce Wayne's character, or Bruce Wayne, to get back into the Batman character and return, because ever since the events of The Dark Knight, he's not been Batman essentially. And to bring him back and to have her doing that and bring him back to fight Bane, Dark Knight Rises is really good. Really good. And I never really get where the criticism comes from. because the quality is there. And if you simply go, is Dark Knight Rises as good as Dark Knight? No, it's not. But that's a bit of a redundant statement, because if you say how good is the Nolan trilogy as a whole, it's awesome. It's as good a trilogy as there's been probably in about 10 years. Since from 2020 back to 2010, of that, it's probably as good a trilogy as there has been in that time. There's a certain trilogy in the early 2000s that I do prefer, and I think you might know what that one is. But anyway, there is so much quality in here. There is so much. The fight scenes seem brutal, because that's one thing the Dark Knight didn't have as much, because of course the Joker and Heath Ledger's Joker is more of like a Weasley villain, if you get what I mean, where he's like slick it, and he's not someone who is going to get into a fist fight with Batman, because he's obviously not going to win. It's not something, even he doesn't really even have hired guns that are the size of Bane to fight him. Whereas in Dark Knight Rises, there's that brilliant scene, the Born in the Darkness, the scene I'm talking about, where they fight in that kind of sewage area, and that always sticks in my brain as one of the best fist fights in film that I can remember in recent memory. And you actually get the villain winning. You get that dynamic, and it's not just the Batman story where he wins and kills the villain or beats the villain. Of course, he doesn't kill the villain, but he beats the villain, and that's it. It isn't a very cut and dry. It's a very long, drawn out, thoughtful process throughout, and The Dark Knight Rises is really good. It is really good, and I just think comparing it to The Dark Knight is just so unfair to the quality that this film has. I think even and the ambiguity of the ending as well. Of course, I'm not going to start going into the details of an ending. While I try not to keep it, or I try to hide the spoilers from these videos. I think the ending and the way it wraps up the trilogy is a brilliant end. I think as a trilogy, the Nolan trilogy of Batman films is so strong, it can't even be understated how good it is, how good they are. I think you could show them to anybody and they would find quality, whether that be a teenager, whether that be a 60-year-old person. It would not matter. The quality is there, and the love and craft that put into it, not only by Christopher Nolan as in the directing side of things, but also by Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne. Let's talk a little bit about him before I move on to the next one, because this is obviously the end of his tenure as the Batman. And we've had Robert Pattinson's Batman now, and we're in that scenario and that iteration. But you cannot understate how good Christian Bale is anyway, just as an actor. He's appeared on Five of the Best on multiple occasions, all the way back to even the first video I did in the year 2000 of an iconic role. I'll let you go and watch that for yourself. But Christian Bale is so good as the Batman. Is he the most... He's not a stoic Batman. He's more of a... I wouldn't say emotional, but he conveys himself more than others would. And it's clear his intentions, whereas other Batman iterations are more methodical, more thinkers than doers. And Christian Bale, I will always, and I know a lot of you will be in the same mind as me on this, I will always look back on the Nolan trilogy with fondness. I will always revisit it every so often and watch at least one of them, whether that be I watch, set aside a day or two and do a marathon of all three films, or just watch The Dark Knight, or just watch The Dark Knight Rises, and just enjoy myself watching them, because it is so... I just think it's hard not to love these three films overall. Do they vary in quality? Yes, a little bit, because Batman Begins and Dark Knight Rises aren't as good as The Dark Knight. In other news, water is wet. Everybody knows that. But don't ever let them forget, or don't ever let that take away from the fact of how good the other two films are. And Batman Begins, yes, on that year, as I say, it wasn't, the year I have the Five of the Best, it was only an honourable mention, but it could easily have broke into the fifth or fourth. It was just the quality of that year. That doesn't mean that I don't think that Batman Begins is so good. This whole trilogy is great. You know how good this trilogy is. I'm not even going to waste any more time on this. Dark Knight Rises is awesome. If you have not seen it somehow, mean, you have, so I'm not even wasting my breath. Go watch it again. Let's move on to the next one. Number 2. Sinister is directed by Scott Derrickson and stars Ethan Hawke, Juliette Rylance, and James Ransone. And here we are, the highest a horror film has ever placed on 5 of the best to date. And why is that, I hear you ask? Why is that above things like The Dark Knight Rises and Skyfall? Because Sinister is in my top 3 horror films of all time. Sinister achieves... Oh my god, where do I even start with this film? Where do I even start? Because around this time, and around kind of 2010 to 2015, there's a lot of stinkers when it comes to horror. A lot of things that get hashed out around the time of things like Paranormal Activity. And while the first Paranormal Activity was, I suppose, fine for a low-budget horror film, yeah, okay, that was alright. And, you know, then it got to the point where it had so many sequels. And Sinister, of course, has a sequel that also kind of falls into that trope of just sequel, and they're just, yeah, not very good. However, one shining light in that kind of period of forgettable horror, we'll call it, Sinister is absolutely brilliant. And if number 1 wasn't so good, it would have been number 1 this year. And you may say, that's really high praise, putting it above the last 2 films you talked about. I'm right there with you. It is high praise. But it's worthy of it. Let's start with Ethan Hawke. Ethan Hawke, who has been on and been in and featured in so many films over his tenure as an actor. He's one of those actors that seems to have done it all. He's been in a variety of genres, never mind films. And he always seems to give either a quality to top tier quality performance. But him in this film in particular, and the scenario that he is placed in, and this is something that gets a bit understated when you talk about, you know, the sense of horror movie characters, where they're all kind of stupid. Most horror movies, or certainly the generic ones and the forgettable ones, the horror movie characters are really stupid for no reason. They get put in these scenarios and they just make silly decisions, and you think they were egging to get themselves killed in the quickest way possible with their decisions. You know, they go down into the basement and they get themselves killed just by, I'll check it out alone. You're like, right, okay, well, you've checked me out because you're that stupid. The characters in Sinister, in particular Ethan Hawke as Ellison in this film, isn't like that. You understand his motives. Is he the smartest person of all time? No, because of course he puts his family in this scenario. A little bit unknowingly, I'll admit, but of course he does put them in the scenario. But it's not like he deliberately tries to be awkward. You get of course he's the quote-unquote field writer. He has this hit years ago when he wrote this book, and he hasn't been able to achieve that greatness since. They move into this house, and unbeknownst to the rest of the family, this house is a murder house, essentially. That's essentially the premise. I'm not going to go too far into it like that. But you know what's the best part about this film? And if you've seen this, you know exactly what I'm about to say. It's the Super 8 films. The kind of reels in the attic that he finds and goes through. Absolutely horrific. Even thinking about them now, they're so effective in conveying horror. This whole film is. And I have said this on, I don't know how many times I've said this when it comes to talk about horror films, but to see cheap jump scares, there's not many things in movies that I hate more than a cheap jump scare. Somebody walking down a hall and a cat jumps out and goes, wah! And then literally there's like this big sound effect to make the audience jump. I hate nothing more than that when it comes to going to the cinema. Not that, don't get me wrong, fake jump scares or fake out jump scares can be effective and can be good, but you see cheap ones that are just there to get the audience to like jolt a bit in their seat, get that out of here. Do you know what Sinister has? Sinister has probably 2 or 3 of the best jump scares, I would say, ever. I would say if you were talking about the top 10 jump scares, top 10 maybe the better way to put it is top 10 more effective jump scares. And of course it's subjective and horror and blah 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 blah. Yeah, okay. people might see Sinister and go, oh, maybe it's not for me, I didn't think it was that scary. Fine, that's no problem. But it's hard to deny the effectiveness of the Super 8 films, connected with the jump scares, connected with the whole scenario as a whole, the whole situation that this family, in particular Ethan Hawke, is put in, and his wife Tracy in the film, played by Juliet Rylance, and even the deputy who works with the Deputy So-and-so, as he's known in the film, James Ransone, who of course went on to play an older Eddie in It Chapter 2, wasn't that right? And, it really... There's not a character in this that's stupid for stupid's sake. And I love that. I love that. Competent people in horror movies that just get it. As soon as things are about to kick off, they're not going, okay, let's just hole up in this one room and wait to be killed. They do something about it. I love that. And they twist. I want to say twist. It's not really a twist. It's kind of been teased throughout the film, and I'm obviously not going to spoil what happens. But the scenario in the final act is brilliantly effective. So effective, and there's some true scares in Sinister. If you're not really a horror person, maybe not for you, because I find, and I would say I have a decent enough tolerance for horror films and games and shows, and I would say it's maybe as strong as some people, maybe not the strongest of all time, I'll admit, but there is a lot of people that would be freaked out like I was when they see Sinister. It's as simple as that. Because when I talked about other horror films, I think there's only maybe one or two that have ever appeared on 5 of the best to date. And spoiler, there will be more as we come into the latter years of this decade. But I think Sinister stands so high on my list of just films in general. Sinister is so good. It's always one, if somebody says to me, what would be your favourite horror film that I wouldn't have seen? Because if people say, I love The Shining. The Shining is, of course, undoubtedly one of those brilliant films. But most people, even people that aren't horror fans, have seen The Shining in some capacity. They know the iconic parts. Whereas Sinister, not a whole lot of people seen. And before I move on, I just want to touch on Scott Derrickson as a director. Scott Derrickson is someone that I didn't know much of. And admittedly, to this date, I don't know too much of him. But my experiences with him as a director is only 3 films. It's been this, which I adore, which you've been sitting listening to me wax lyrical about this film. Then he directed the first Doctor Strange, which I thought was fine, but there wasn't obviously many horror elements to explore. It's more of a kids film, or a pre-teen film, if you like, or whatever the target audience is for the Marvel films. And the argument can be made, but they're for everybody. Yeah, I suppose they are, but they weren't like Sinister, let's put it that way. But then after that, we had, not too long ago, we had The Black Phone, which again was Ethan Hawke paired with Scott Derrickson. And that was another really effective horror film. Is it as good as Sinister? It wasn't. But it had a lot of the things I loved about Sinister, and that's why I really enjoyed that film. The Black Phone was really good. And it was awesome to see. You get that, where you get these directors and actors that are paired together, like, throughout time. Tarantino has a lot of them, or I don't know, Spielberg or Scorsese in particular has loads of actors that he always relies on over and over again. This is like that. Derrickson and Ethan Hawke is a match made in heaven. Him and Sinister is great. Sinister overall is just fantastic as a horror film for me. Of course it's subjective. You could watch it and go, I didn't think it was that scary. I didn't really like it. Fair enough. But I love Sinister. And I would recommend it to anybody. If you're a horror fan, if you're not even a horror fan, but you like a thriller that's an effective, tension-building story, Sinister has that. It's a perfect named film, and it's exactly what I want. Whenever I go see a horror now, there's so many tropes that I hope that they can bring back that was so effective as that they did in Sinister, because there's so many horror films that I see now, or even around this time, as I said, about this forgettable era of horror that was all very generic, million sequels, and just not very good. Sinister, it stands so tall as a film, never mind a horror film, and that's why I would definitely recommend it. However, it's not my number one, because my number one for this year is Number 1. Django Unchained is directed by Quentin Tarantino and stars Jamie Foxx, Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, Kerry Washington, and Samuel L. Jackson. So you're probably thinking, where is it? Where is it? Surely it's in the top 5. Surely if it's not honorable mention, then it's got to be 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or what. Django Unchained was always going to be number 1 for this year. Sometimes whenever I'm writing these lists, and I've said this before, sometimes I go, oh, maybe that might be number 2, or that might be 1, or maybe I move that down to 3, or... When I looked at 2012, there was one thing that was absolutely for certain. Django Unchained was number 1. Because Django Unchained, and I do not say this lightly by the way, Django Unchained is one of the best Tarantino films. It is... And that is no small feat, considering the quality of all of Tarantino films, especially of his 9, isn't it, at this current time, where he's made his 9 films, from that's anything all the way back to Reservoir Dogs to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where just Tarantino is one of my favourite directors. And I've mentioned it before when I talked about Kill Bill, or I talked about Inglourious Bastards, so a lot of the things will be repeating the same point, so I apologise for that. But it's something that Tarantino does well, and it's something I just adore. It's dialogue. Dialogue in film, when done right, and there's very little times in Tarantino's films that he doesn't do it right, and I can't even think off the top of my head, especially of those 9 films, when dialogue hasn't been crisp, it hasn't been just as good as it gets, especially in something like Reservoir Dogs. A scene in that I always remember is the tipping scene at the very start when they're in the restaurant before anything even happens. Just general dialogue because it feels so... What's the word? It feels so authentic. It doesn't feel like these actors are reading a script. And that's something that is a hard thing to convey, because even no matter how switched on you are to a film, or switched off, in the sense of being lost in the film, you're always kind of... Okay, well, yeah, he walked to that part and said that part. Even in the kind of back of your brain, even though you switch it off a little bit, subconsciously you're like, okay, well, that was clearly mapped out that way. Or maybe I'm a psychopath and I didn't think that. But you know what I mean? Like, you do. But I find myself getting lost in Tarantino films more than most other directors or most other films. And in Django Unchained, to have such a serious subject matter in slavery and have it conveyed in such a brutal way, if you get what I mean, throughout the film, and you would say, because yes, it's dialed up, if you like, the characters, and that's something that can maybe some people would maybe put as a flaw of Tarantino's characters, but I think it's one of the best things about his films, is that his characters are always dialed up to 11. They're always on another level. People like Leonardo DiCaprio in this film, and let's go through a few performances in particular, but let's start with Leonardo DiCaprio as our kind of villain, if you like, of this film. Himself along with Samuel L. Jackson, and by the way, what a pairing that is. Having them two together is just, oh my god, 2 of my favourite actors. But him as isn't it Calvin in the film, where he's that kind of ranch owner, and he's just evil. He's just evil for evil's sake, and you can tell he relishes in being evil. And having Samuel L. Jackson as kind of counterpart with him, and the two of them. But then on the flip side, you've got Christoph Waltz and Jamie Foxx, and also what a pairing that is. And let's talk about Christoph Waltz before we get to Jamie Foxx, of course, as our lead, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about him when we get there. But Christoph Waltz, I'll admit, he was in he appeared in a few of those Bond films, tying us back to Skyfall there, but of course he wasn't in that one, but he was in Spectre, and he was in No Time to Die in the minimal parts. But Christoph Waltz in particular in Inglourious Bastards was the first time I really was like, this guy he's just wonderful. He's just like, you've captured a star here. You really have. And just let it be free on the world, because he is just so good in Inglourious Bastards on the evil side, if you like, the villain side of the dynamic being set for that film. Whereas on this, and of course, he's one of those ones, and you get that with some really great characters and great villains, are the ones you kind of love to hate. You know what I mean? People like Heath Ledger's Joker. People even like Tom Hardy's Bane. Where these are like, these villains, of course they're evil, and of course they're not someone we should be rooting for. But I do kind of like them, though. You know, it is kind of like that. It's kind of hard not to like their nature, hard not to like their confidence. Maybe that's the word. Maybe their swagger and their charisma, even in an evil way. And Django Unchained, Christoph Waltz with Jimmy Fox in this film, and the way, especially those dinner scenes, you know, when they're in the ranch or the estate and they're sitting at the table. It's Christoph Waltz and Jimmy Fox sitting with Leonardo DiCaprio and Samuel L. Jackson. That scene is just, oh, that is creme de la creme. That is just perfection. Perfection. I love it. I love Django Unchained. And let's talk a little bit about Jimmy Fox, because Jimmy Fox, he's known for so many things now. He's known for, you know, his singing. He's known for his acting, of course. And he's done so much. But it's hard to nail down one role. I know people would always maybe think back to Ray or think back to, you know, other roles that maybe are dramatic and things like that. But for me, him as Django in this is the best. It's the best thing that Jimmy Fox has ever done. It's the best performance he's ever gave. It's the way he holds his own, I should say, with people like these kind of legendarily top tier actors, with, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio in particular. Of course, Leonardo DiCaprio is, and he is another one that has appeared so many times on Five of the Best at this point, will continue to appear in the next 10 years, and you know, there's a good batting average, or there's a good chance that Leonardo DiCaprio will probably appear. If he's not appearing one year in Five of the Best, he'll appear in the next. You know, he's at least once. He's at least once either each year or every other year. So to have Jimmy Fox in those scenarios and holding his own and not feeling out of place, it's a real testament to him. Real testament to him. And it just shows that Quentin Tarantino did such a great job in casting this film and conveying the story being told. Because, as I say, it's not a... Yes, there's a sense of, yeah, go on, get them. You know, it is that kind of like, you know, get that vengeance that you deserve. There is that. But it's, of course, the subject matter is it's a hard-hitting one in some ways, and there's certainly some quite brutal scenes, particularly with Kerry Washington, who's also brilliant in this film. Django Unchained is just, you know, I could keep talking about different particulars and all that, but I just love this. I love Django Unchained. It's another reason why I adore Tarantino as a director. There's so many of these films, you know, and the ones I've mentioned, the ones that we will mention undoubtedly in the coming years of Tarantino, he is up there with my favourite directors, and Django Unchained is a great example and a shining example of why I love him as a director, and these performances and everything about it. Even me talking about Django Unchained now makes me want to go and rewatch it, and I only rewatched it not that long ago. I love this movie. It's definitely in my top 20 movies of all time. I think Django Unchained is such a brilliant... You know, I was going to try and use a different word there. It's a brilliant movie. Like, I could just simply brilliant movie. Everything about it is just so good. So good. Performances, charisma, chemistry, direction, cinematography, score, everything. Django Unchained is awesome. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a treat. Give yourself that treat and go and watch it. And that's why it's my number one for the year 2012. So that's been the year 2012. A brilliant year. Such a good year. And I suppose the greatest thing about these are doing the five of the best and you know, chatting about the five that I love. A great indicator, and I know I mentioned this previously, but it stands true. It's the quality of the honourable mentions at the start of the video will show you how good this year is. And to have films in there like Life of Pi, like Lincoln, like even The Hobbit and Unexpected Journey. I know not everybody loves that film, and you know my love of Lord of the Rings, we've been following the series. For that to not even get into the top 5, that shows the quality of it. Or Flight. There's so much quality for 2012. It's a year I always look back on fondly, of the quality of it. But let's talk about the ones that were closest to breaking into the top 5. Which of those honourable mentions were closest? And I'll admit, number 5 changed a few times. 21 Jump Street, I ended up going with because it's one of those comedies that I always, you know, that thing I've said about, like, it stands out. It's a film and it's a comedy that I always, it's kind of like, it's one of the pillars of that golden, for me, that golden era of comedies, 2008 to 2012, and that was why it got the top, just into the top 5. Who was closest breaking into the top 5? I would say, of the honourable mentions, the closest to get into the top 5 would have been Flight with Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington in Flight, and that film as a whole, is brilliant. It's so good. It's so good. A lot of people maybe think, oh, I'm surprised you didn't say Lincoln. I'm surprised you didn't say Life of Pi. I like those films a lot. I'll admit with Lincoln is one of those films, and again, this is me saying something that may as well be saying water is wet, but Daniel Day-Lewis is fantastic in that film as Abraham Lincoln. He is the shining light, but I think the film around it, take away his performance, and the film itself doesn't blow me away, but the performance alone gets him an honorable mention for that. Life of Pi is one of the most visually stunning films that I've ever seen, and to this date I've ever seen. Some of those scenes with the main character on the boat with the tiger looking out over the, you know, it's just everything about that film is beautiful. Life of Pi is beautiful, and it was also quite close too, but I remember looking at the honorable mentions and it was between Flight and 21 Jump Street, and I just thought 21 Jump Street is the one that I'm more likely to turn on again and watch. So that was why I landed at that. Not any big reason more than it, not that a comedy's better than a drama or anything like that. It was just, that was how I came to that. But yeah, 2012 was a really good year. Really quality year, had quite a variety. We had, you know, what a lot of people said was their favourite James Bond film in Skyfall. We had the end of the Nolan trilogy in The Dark Knight Rises. And then we had Sinister, which, you know, I'm not even going to say any more about, but you know, after listening to me there, how much I love it. But yeah, Django Unchained, as I said there, was always my number one. I went through the IMDb list that you can see in the description, and I just went through, and as soon as I seen and you know you get that where it's like instantly that's it. You know, like there would have to be some real quality films to have broken Django off the top spot. But it didn't happen. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a great year. 2012 was an awesome year of film. And now we're getting into the, you know, as we approach the middle of this decade, there's a lot more quality to come. And I know I say that nearly in every 5 of the best video, but the quality of this decade as a whole, it's just, there's so much to love, so much to adore, so many films that I always would hang my hat on loving so much. You know, these films that I always look back on and go, oh, that's one of those, you know, as I said about Django, like top 20. There's a lot of them to come. That films that I always would remember with such fondness, with such love, and with such admiration for what the directors and the performances and everything were able to achieve. So yeah, that's been 2012. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about these movies. If you do enjoy listening to me talk about movies, I'd love for you to stick around. If you want to stick around, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. It means you'll be notified every time a 5 of the best video goes up, or an initial thoughts, or whatever is on the channel goes up live. I would love for you to do that. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, let me know. And if you do stick around, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.